So validity. I'm not sure if people find validity challenging, but whenever I read articles about validity, my eyes get fogged over a bit with all the different types of validity. And we put this in our presentation 5 years ago, 3 years ago. And every time I think about, because my background is not psychology, so Dave was going to jump in. So I thought to myself, well, validity applies to the whole model, but it also applies to variables. And how do we distinguish that? These different things people call validity. So what I did this time is, let's go. So we have a checklist, and it has 3 entries in it, and we can add more. I just had enough time for 3. Some cautions about validity, and I have some examples. No, so the first one, hold it, is something we call face value.
Face validity.
Face validity. I don't know why I keep thinking face value, but yes, face validity. And so what does this mean? Well, first thing, I'm dividing the world into measurement tools. This is measuring some index. We have index, a reputation. Is this index actually measuring something in the world? And people think of validity in terms of how things are measured. But I also want to think about validity in terms of how it applies to the model variables. So on the left, I have how it applies to model variables, and the right, I have how it's defined in the world of looking at measurement tools and how things are measured. So in the weakest sense, we have face validity, which means if I have something on a model called squishiness, like maybe we're in a kindergarten class and someone's talks about squishiness, well, no one really has an idea what that means. Because it's not something that's really visible in the real world. Whereas if I say reputation, yeah, we know reputation is there. We know even people measure reputation and we respond to reputation. So on the face of it, reputation appears, it satisfies this weak form of validity. It is something in the world that we can refer to. And when we talk about the reputation index that we gave earlier, the RepTrak index on reputation, we have to ask, does it really measure what it's supposed to measure? Does reputation measure what it's supposed to measure? Do people think the tool is a good measure of corporate reputation? So that's this one. This is the easiest one. The next one we have is something called construct validity. By the way, jump in with any questions if you have any questions. We get to the next one here. So construct validity is, does the tool measure, let's talk about the tool. Does it measure its intended construct? In other words, is there a theory behind this reputation or any other thing? Is there a theory that I could refer to that this is verifying or validating? Is there something in the world that's has a theoretical concept around this? Does it appropriately relate to other things? Like, for example, does reputation, well, basically, is there a theory about it? How is it related to trust, for example? If I have trust in my model, does reputation relate to trust in the appropriate way? So if I look at the variable of reputation, in our model, there is a theory about customers or employees being drawn to companies who have a good reputation. I guess when Microsoft was first coming out, people loved to work there. People who I knew went to Microsoft. And so it attracts them because of their reputation. So our model has that. There was a paper on it, and the paper's here. And I looked at the paper and I said, yeah, let's put that in the model, and there's a loop. So it does correspond to some theoretical framework, something that's happening in the world that corresponds to reputation. Okay. Does reputation affect people's decision to stop buying companies' products? Well, that's another thing, and it does. Like Thomas the Tank. When people found lead in there and they didn't respond appropriately, what Thomas the Tank or the RC2 company who made Thomas the Tank engine said was, oh, it's the Chinese company who painted our thing. It's not us. Oh, and they were blaming, and oh, if you have a problem, just mail us your product and we'll replace it and give you the mailing fee. Very, very distant, no warmth, no expertise shown. It's just a blaming. So the quality concerns did affect their reputation, and they, of course, lost customers. So that's the type of thing this is about, I believe. The next one construct validity is, content validity. So what is the extent to which a measure represents all facets of a given construct? Okay, well, I guess I mentioned reputation refers to trust, and earlier on we gave a definition of reputation as being the trustworthiness people have in a company's products. The measurement tool may need to measure these facets. Now, for our model on the left here, what are the meanings of the construct? So David and I struggled in the beginning. Do we need to put trust in the model? Is it enough? Is reputation enough? Because the author of Reputation Rules talks about trust. And we concluded that the concept of reputation itself was enough. It included the trust. So we just have to make sure that when we look at the data, that reflects our decision. I noticed when I went to one of the talks this week that someone had trust and reputation in the model. So so two soft variables, and it was a closed loop diagram, and I'm thinking, well, that might be appropriate. In his model, he'd have to say, well, what's the measure of trust? What's the measure of reputation? And how are they related, and what's the differences in the content of what we're asking about? I have trust in a company. I value its reputation. How different is that? Do I need to worry about that difference? Mm-hmm. So those are my thoughts. And every time I do this, I think more about how do I take these concepts and apply them just to variables, soft constructs, as opposed to the whole model. You also have to apply these to the whole model, but this is focusing on the variables you have. And I think these are just giving you a checklist of things to think about, because I know that looking at some of these things made me I decided on certain decisions based on some of these concepts. And there's more. There's predictive validity, and there's all sorts of strange name validity types things. You can go on and on with them. And some of them may be important.
Right. And Pascal, I'll just say, in the context of reputation, remember early on, or in the part one, we talked about this idea of the trust radar, and that it had different dimensions or factors: empathy, transparency, expertise, commitment. And then you heard us kind of talk about how we kind of started to summarize the effects of that in terms of warmth and competence. So the content validity gets at, what dimensions do you want to make explicit that you think are kind of important to understanding this construct? Do they all need to be represented? Can they be kind of in a sense, aggregated in some way in one variable name or concept? That's the kind of thing. I'm working on another project. A lot of this stuff about different levels of validity and reliability come out of psychometrics, and you can be very sophisticated in how you kind of demonstrate that you have an effective measurement model. And sometimes there are questions about whether certain ways of asking questions in a psychological study all kind of tap into some sort of latent variable, again, like maybe reputation, or,
so by latent, what do you mean? You mean it's not in the model, but you should be?
Theoretical, something, it gets at these ideas that we've been trying to kind of describe. Something that is theoretically out there that we're looking for in this way, trying to kind of find empirical indicators of it that would show some sort of, in this case, statistical pattern of association with this theoretical idea that we have. So that's what we're getting at. And it's a dance, right? It's an iterative process.
Yes, iterative, totally iterative.
About, how fine-grained you need and want to be. And it comes back to, again, really appreciating what's the purpose of this model for the people that you're working with.
I was about to go into a PowerPoint presentation which showed all our maps or hexagon diagrams, but I said that's too much.
Well, I don't know. You might want to show that just because that isn't.
Okay, so let me.
I think that I think it's useful because it shows what we went through as we were starting to, synthesize just this one book and concepts in it.
So, this doesn't have the this just has our flow diagram, which is in another tool.
These
Yeah.
were just kind of like our ways of for this particular project, eliciting variables and starting to think about how they may be related.
This is for the reputation crisis management model where there's a crisis, and we were using this tool called South Beach to say what affects it, what is the negative effect on it, what the consequences are. So it was just our way of trying to map out trust radar. Things have to be transparent, expertise, empathy. We just tried to understand what was going on. And then we also had, which it's not easily available now, a map which showed all our hexagon diagrams, how things were related.
Somebody already said it in the chat, but again, I mean, really kind of like figuring out what's the foreground and the background in terms of the ideas that you want to have represented in your model. That's kind of like this process that we're talking about now. Okay, go ahead.
So again, assessing the validity of your variable helps you critique the validity of your model. And you may have to enhance the model and some of the constructs to be more consistent with that. So validity actually helps along the way, not just when you're done. So actually along the way. Okay, so now I've got this, variables in my, I've got soft constructs and changing the variables, I put them in my models. How do I combine them? I know that Ralph mentioned the Stanford prisoner experiment, and we're not actually going to cover that here. Well, I may have covered one piece of it, but that's a model that's actually in the website that you can actually look at and run. And if you expand this more, and then what we're showing, this mind map, there's also more examples in here about that. But we're going to look at how you combine them. Sometimes you add them, sometimes you multiply them, and so we'll look at that. So this model, we're looking at, let's see. One way of relating them was through, we mentioned this earlier, through a graphic, that the more customer concerns there are, the customer, so there were several ways of saying, okay, customers have concerns, they're not being met, what happens? Well, they leave the company. They leave being your customer, whatever that means. And how do you model that? Well, you could have an effect on the flow, or what I did here was have it on the time. Mm-hmm. So that the bigger this number is, the faster they leave. That worked here, okay. And I tried it another place in another model, and it didn't work as well. So I did have it on the effect. So you have to see what seems to work based on the parameters you have. And this might be interesting. You might find that experimentally, you could test the various options, whether you want to have the effect on the time or the effect on the flow directly, and see that. I guess the effect on the flow will be 1 over this. This effect would be in the numerator. So you could use a graphical function to relate variables.
And what this is doing too is it's translating the units of one variable into something into meaningful units of something else. So there's almost always an effect of the antecedent variable on the outcome variable, if you will, in the model. And you
got to translate them.
Like building it with the graphical lookup table is often, it's a very common approach to relating variables, soft variables in the stock and flow diagram.
And this is the model. Part of your model is this little diagram here. Whoever that model is, that's part of your model. That's actually.
And Pascal, I don't know. I mean, I think the 0 to 4 is arbitrary, or though it might.
Yes, the 0 to 4 is to meet your data. You can have a number in here, and then you can have a scale factor outside the effect. If the ratio of this to this is about the same, you can scale it by having a factor out here that magnifies or decreases this effect. So yeah, the 0 to 4 is okay. So I'm telling a story. I have my causal loop diagram. I'm creating a stock and flow diagram. Now I want to make sure it works, right? So I play around with things until I get data that looks reasonable. So that's what I did for here. If this was a real world problem, I would get case studies and investigate different scenarios that people did, and I'd say, okay, if I do this, it sort of matches this, and it also matches this case. And if I change this, it matches both cases. So I'd be experimenting that way. This way, I just made something that actually made sense when I looked at the results. So
I just wanted to note that the actual diagram is very linear.
what does linear mean?
Well, it's not a straight line from 0 to 4, but it's fairly close to it.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh yeah, okay. In Stella, you can choose different options, and I've chosen different ones depending on what made sense. Yes, you're right. It could be linear. I could have made this a linear function. So I didn't have to use this. I could just made it a line.
So this is a really important point.
Yeah.
I mean, here Pascal has this like slightly, I guess you would say, kind of convex thing. So it's almost linear. There could be some sort of S-shaped pattern.
Mm-hmm.
There could be a convex. So, and the question is like, why would you kind of, you know, embroider on the lookup table that way? And again, I think it comes back to like what you know and what you don't know about the phenomenon that you're representing.
Yeah.
What data do you have that might inform some sort of nonlinearity in the association?
Mm-hmm.
Because very often we're working with correlation coefficients or other effect sizes that have been kind of produced from just from the general linear model, from statistics based on the general linear model. So thinking about whether you need or want to do that would be important, or whether there's utility to that. Of course, looking at the performance of the variable relative to like what you were hypothesizing or expecting or wanting to confirm happen is also important. But then keep in mind that, again, explaining your model, I mean, it may be more straightforward and more conservative to assume a linear.
And we could have done that. And as Ralph, and you're correct, we could have put that in here. It would have made much difference, I think.
Well, and
I'm trying to, yeah.
That's getting at issues of sensitivity and things like that. But,
yes.
But all of these things are possible. And then, and again, it comes back to like, what is your objective with the model?
Let me explain that. It's a good question. My objective with this model is to pick out things in our presentation that I can illustrate. So I had a menu. I said, okay, I don't have an illustrated this yet. Let me put that in the model. So there were external criteria based on my audience. I want to make sure my model just doesn't do the same thing and has the same structure. I want to put a coflow in. I want to put a biflow in here. I want, I want to put inflow and outflows in. I want to make sure that, like, one of the reputation models has a biflow, one has an inflow and outflow for the reputation. So we're just showing how different ways can do it. There's something that I'm not going to go into, but I actually used some of this when I was doing one of the modeling efforts. There's a cognitive algebra that it shows you how to combine things to make them 1 or 0, or the average. And so this was from a book. John Hayward had this and reminded me of this. He wrote a paper in 2014, which is about this. But we're not going to talk much about that here. Okay, so additive. Can I add? This is I decided to include this in here because it was my one example I had of adding variables, one good example. This is the one that Ralph talked about, where people are put into an experiment, and half of them, some of them act as prisoners, some of them act as guards, and they actually take the role of who they are. They actually emote into the role. So a prisoner will actually act like a prisoner, and a guard will actually be fierce. So in this case, the prisoners resist, and the way they modeled this was they modeled it additively. So so the prisoners are fearful, and prisoners are repressed by guards, and that's going to affect the prisoner's resistance. And at one point, it just jumps.
And what's the implication of having an additive relationship here? If one of those factors is 0 and the other is still contributing, you're going to see some sort of effect.
Yes.
But if those were multiplicative and one was 0, then everything shuts down.
Everything shuts down.
I mean, you guys know that. But
yes,
I mean,
that's the point.
Yeah.
And that's, if you look at the cognitive algebra I had, that situation is there. x is x plus y, y goes to 0, there's still something happening. But if x times y goes to 0, nothing, it shuts down everything. So you have to think about what phenomena you're trying to illustrate. And you can have some combination of things.
And again, theoretically, like, you know, are these kind of independent additive, or is there some sort of interaction going on?
Yes, yes, exactly too. And we're going to talk about, yes, okay, now let's get into outside prisoners. I've gone through this one pretty fast because that was guidance. Okay. So now we're multiplying, and we just said that. If we multiply variables, David just mentioned, use 0 for a variable if it cancels everything.
Right.
Multiplying two variables less than 1 yields a smaller result. Okay. A variable itself could be a product. A motivation could be the effect of winning awards, multiplied by some nominal. Suppose I'm motivated to work on modeling. But yet, when somebody comes with a challenging problem, my normal motivation to do it jumps, you know, 1,000-fold. So there's something that measures something happening, and so my motivation jumps. But I do have a normal average interest in doing certain things. So that's something like what this is. That there's a baseline, and now you're going above the baseline. So there are situations like that in the world, and I think David does a lot more of that modeling. Also, I think it's really useful to, remember we talked about the ratio variables before, having the ratio of, and that's why we're looking at loyalty things. We try to make them ratios because when we look at current loyalty over maximum loyalty, we're really trying to measure on a scale that's sort of linear. Actually, we're describing it as linear scale, but we can map it into something which is not linear. Does that make any sense? Well, in our last graph, my curve went up a little, and it wasn't linear. So, so let's go into some examples. Getting back to your reputation. So this is, yeah, this is the other reputation model we have because we had customers lost. This is the other reputation model we had, and there's several effects of when you know, you can have create offerings or negative what you create and present to customers, like Apple with their new devices, and how your reputation fares overall. So there's two effects: the effects of people making things so you can buy them, or what the reputation of the company has on winning customers. I'm going to go and buy your product if you have a good reputation. So if you don't have a good reputation, forget about what you offer. I don't care. If you have a great reputation but don't offer anything I want, well, I don't want to buy it from you. So that's what that type of thing is. That's the type of thinking is. So that's, yeah, David.
Pascal has subtly kind of emphasized that competitive offerings may in certain situations have a greater effect or contribution than the reputation effect, because he has on the y-axis of those two lookup tables, competitive offerings, the effect on offerings goes from 1 to 2, and for reputation goes from 1 to 1.5. So so that's interesting to think about, and again, it's something to try to justify.
So that's the use of the meaning of multiplicativeness. Does there anybody have any questions at this point? Okay. Now we're getting to something really interesting. At least for me, it was interesting if you think about things. So we have this book, Reputation Rules, and in this book, he talks about trust radar. How does the company get to respond to a crisis? So he had 4 things. He had expertise, empathy, transparency, and commitment. And we started out thinking, well, maybe we're going to model that, those 4. And then we saw some, in the book, he also talks about research, about how companies, when confronted with a problem, when you demonstrate high intellectual warmth but low competence, that's not, they are perceived in the most negative light. Responses that are lower in warmth but higher in competence are perceived less negatively. So competence is a little better. if you have one or the other, like like Mercedes did, I have a lot of expertise, but no show, no warmth, then that's even lower. So there's this relationship. So what we did was two things. We took our 4 concepts, the trust radar, and we said, okay, it may be too complicated for this workshop. Let's just use 2 of them, warmth and competency. Competency for expertise, warmth for empathy in the trust radar concepts. So, and then we refer to this research that was in the book. And the question was, how do you combine these variables so that it makes sense and sort of corresponds to this research? So this was done as an example of how my initial thinking was, and after this could change. My thinking was, well, I looked at warmth, I looked at competence. I first looked at when they were increasing the same, like 1 and 1, 9 and 9. And I noticed that, okay, going up. But what happens if they're very different? If I have if I know if I have 0 warmth and 1 competence, I'm pretty low on the scale. When there's a big difference between them, you're lower. So I actually started with the cognitive algebra, and I just discovered that if you multiply the 2, and I added 1 because I wanted something that when you multiply by it, it didn't make the thing decrease, then you would mirror some of these effects. The bigger the differences had lower overall organizational response, effective organizational response, and so that's what I did. And then I said, well, how do you make it better to have more competency and then expertise if like 0.4 warmth and 0.6 competence, 0.6 warmth and 0.4 competence? I'd want the one with the 0.6 to be a little higher. So I discovered this by adding a little factor to the warmth made it work. So that's how I created this algebraic function, which was a measure of organizational response.
So
actual organization. Anyway.
I mean, it's interesting because I think Pascal really illustrates how we can be very creative in thinking about how to apply empirical work. I mean, he was pulling from themes about how the trust radar really kind of boils down into this warmth competence thing, and then applying these techniques to try to come up with some way of scaling the effect. And we're going to show you this in the model too. But it's interesting because it wasn't simply additive. It wasn't simply additive, and we needed to kind of emphasize one a little bit more than the other. And of course, that factor what was that factor? It was like 0.08 or something like that, Pascal. That
I changed it to 0.01, 0.1. Yeah, it's about a tenth. I just wanted to make the competency effect when you had the opposite, when you had parallel symmetry in the 2 variables. I wanted to make the competency be higher, and we can change that to make it.
And I mean, for our purposes, that was relatively arbitrary, right?
Yeah, it was arbitrary. It was just I wanted to get it to work out according to what I read here. And then if you go into the real world, you can adjust these things to see if this actually makes sense, or have some sort of graphical functions. But right. I like to make algebraic functions when I can. So, and this was an example of how one would think about this. Think about doing what we're talking about, trying to map real experience to some sort of response.
But again, Pascal's like he's leaning on kind of a qualitative interpretation of a body of work, and then coming up with this, which, you know, again, is that sufficient from a validity and reliability perspective? For the purposes of today, it's perfectly fine. It may not be for another project, but the technique and the approach, I think, is still is absolutely reliable and valid.
There's these books called Guesstimation, where you estimate things. It shows you how to estimate things that you don't know anything about. And some of that type of thinking also is an approach here. You try to estimate in the ballpark of what you're thinking and try to be creative with how you manipulate things. Okay.
I have a question. Could you use the same sort of process and be calibrating it to the collective thoughts of a group you're dealing with, for example, so that there's more sense of ownership and it reflects the thinking of a group.
I think you could.
Yeah. I think that so in a group model building kind of approach, if people are weighing in on what's meaningful and what they could kind of, yeah, we often say that if you have data, maybe try to apply it. If you don't, then lean on expertise, and the expertise of people in a group model building project would be an excellent way to come up with a way of justifying a parameter value or a parameter value range. I mean, and then again, in the end, you're going to have to kind of like support those core assumptions. So you'll need some sort of way of, expressing the rationale that you use to kind of arrive at that.
And this is
from a process perspective,
Yeah.
you could say everybody agrees on this is the way we're going to structure the model, and then from there you go forth and collect data and then compare it back. In that
Absolutely, yeah.
I think, yes.
Yes.
So, yes. So they agree on how they're going to structure it, but then they have to agree that when they get the data that they can all agree on how to interpret the data, the next step, to go to the next step. So it's an iterative process. Okay, let's move on. Let's see, let me close this. So now, David is going to demonstrate he's going to talk through and some ideas about the reputation model. Then I'm going to talk through the other model that we did. And then we're going to, if we get to it, we'll talk about how these concepts come into building the model itself. So let me stop sharing so David shares.
Okay. All right, now I will share. And I've called this model up. And
Which model is it now?
so this is the reputation crisis model. So it was the first model that we looked at, and this causal loop diagram it should be fixed now.
It's correct. It's correct. Yeah, effectively.
Right. So we have these different feedback structures, and the interesting thing here was that organizational response could be ineffective or effective, and of course, if it's ineffective, it produces more negative stories faster over time, over a longer period of time. If it's effective, then it produces positive stories, and the positive stories reduce moral outrage, the negative stories increase moral outrage, and over time, hopefully things become kind of like in better control. So let me do my best to just kind of zoom in and out a little bit. So this is the demonstration model, and Pascal just talked through this one kind of maybe particularly interesting aspect of how we were kind of combining soft variables that were driving reputation, organizational reputation. We have so we have these different sections kind of like of the model framed here: stories and outrage, audience and media, corporate reputation, the organization's response, which Pascal was just focusing on, and then these behavior over time graphs that illustrate the main variables. And Pascal has also provided some data that expresses some, in that data manager you can see there are two runs that are kind of like already built into this model or supporting the model. One is where warmth is 1 and competence is 1, and the other is where warmth is 0 and competence is 0. So those two runs kind of like represent for us the scale, the most optimal scenario where the reputational response of the organization is very robust, with warmth and competence being weighted but with a particular factor, even giving it a little bit more of an effect, versus warmth and competence being 0. And that's what we're seeing here. Now, if we look at the table that Pascal just walked us through, and we think about kind of a plausible and not so bad combination of warmth and competence, here we've set a run to 0.6 for warmth and 0.9 for strength. So if we come over here, well, I guess we don't see that 0.6 and 0.9 is not necessarily right there, but that doesn't matter. So we can just run the model here, and let's take a look at some of these variables and maybe talk through them. So if we run the model with that kind of reasonably favorable / less negative outcomes for the organization, kind of combination of these two important parameters, and Elizabeth was asking about the switches, Pascal. We want to talk about that. We did turn them on right now. There's a way of setting up basically this idea of a crisis or an assault to the reputation that happens, and then we can talk about that in a moment. But in any case, so this third run now, you can see that with this combination of warmth and competence, we see that media attention, which is represented on a scale from 0 to 100, it goes up, but then it's starting to go down over time, which is a good thing in general, I think, if you're trying to, move beyond a crisis. You can see that that is associated with positive and negative stories. Pascal, these positive and negative stories are not scaled on any particular rate, right? They can be as low as 0 and can go to whatever.
I tried to set this parameter so they don't blow up to 1 trillion, but yes.
And you can see the relationship where it's the negative stories as the theory or as the model kind of projects, kind of like jumping up initially. And then because of the organizational response, we're seeing kind of like the counteracting effect of the positive stories over time. Here's a picture of the moral outrage, which we can talk a little bit more about this, but it's a pulse that kind of like...
well, the crisis starts at time 3. So if you look in the furthermost left column, it says reputational crisis. That starts at time 3. I set that up that way.
Okay, yeah, and this structure, we can look at it as a smooth, where we have the moral outrage kind of like going up, and that's in response to the negative stories. Mm-hmm. And then these things are, slowly you kind of like see what's happening with the perceived versus the actual moral outrage in the community. Here's reputation, and what you're seeing is that they have a pretty strong reputation, and there's some ability to kind of like recover. It's not as robust as that one ideal situation, but it's much more favorable than this trajectory where they're basically doing nothing. These are all interesting trajectories. Maybe, Pascal, what would be interesting to like show people in the model itself, or do we want to run some other analyses? What do people want to see? Because I could jump in.
Well, the reputation up there is a biflow, right?
Okay, yeah,
the
that's
structure of the reputation is a biflow.
So in this particular model, we chose to set reputation up as a biflow. So we have there's a time constant in this case 8 weeks to change reputation, and you can see the convention here. Reputation is something that's scaled from 0 to 100 reputation units. And because the max reputation is 100, we know that this is going to go between 0 and 100. What you have here is max reputation minus whatever the reputation is at a time. So you have that gap. And this is just this is simple, smooth structure. And what's driving this, though, is public sentiment. Where is public sentiment? Public sentiment is here, and that is ultimately where the public sentiment is then, right here, just driving reputation.
Yes, in the reputation thing, it's just, if you look at it, it's just a
This is interesting because basically we're saying that these dynamics impact public sentiment, and public sentiment, the outcome of that is some impact on reputation. But then reputation management and basically their response is what's kind of shaping this over time.
So look at the equations of public sentiment for a second. Just click on the equations of public sentiment. Just click, just go, yeah, it's up there in it's up there in reputation.
Oh, okay, right.
Just click on, just click on one of them. It's up in reputation right there.
Right here.
So if you look at it, it's positive stories over the total number of stories, but there is a factor, a negative story factor there. That factor means that people pay more attention to negative stories than to positive ones. That's a experiential. Yeah. So what we added, it's 5. We made it 5. So we added that in there because it's going to make it less. So that's how we added that piece in there. So that's also, public sentiment is also a proxy. We looked at a ratio of 2 things, the stories. And then we weighted.
So public sentiment is here.
Yeah.
And we just saw the equation. So here are the negative stories and the positive stories, and this is the factor.
And I think it's 1. We could weigh it more if we wanted to. Yeah.
You could weigh it more. So I mean, if we wanted to weigh it more, so like let's say we want to
make it 5. Yeah, make it 1.1. Yeah, you run it again, you can see what happens.
And then we'll run the model.
That means negative stories are going to be weighted more. And so, but not, no, if you make it 5 and see what happens.
Oh, okay. And I think, well, we could, let's just show, okay.
Yeah, we can.
And let's make it 5.
I mean, you could blow up the model, who knows?
And
it should, and then let's look at the story. Let's go back to the story picture.
Well, here's like, so now you can see run 5.
Yeah.
We're looking at public sentiment staying quite low.
Go into the reputation. Let's look at the plots. Go to the left to see the plots.
Okay.
How the plots look. So don't kill it yet. Just go to the, yeah. Just go to the plots.
Right, here's 5.
Yeah. Let's see what the plots look like. So reputation got a little lower. Look, reputation dropped a bit.
Yeah.
I think the plot over here with positive stocks and negative stocks doesn't have the current in it, the current, the total positive plus negative. If you look at go below that, yeah, the current, so the negative stories, the positive stories and negative stories are about the same. See, 50-50, they're different. So that plot above it, it doesn't have the current runs in it. That's why we're not seeing it change. Anyway.
Well.
So okay. you can adjust that based on the experiments.
Yeah. So that was, but so that was that factor.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so other questions or things to kind of look at in this model, or something that people want to kind of explore over time? For the most part, I mean, I guess we're looking at overall relationships in the model, and comparing it to kind of like the 2 extremes. And for the most part, the model seems to perform as we would expect. But there are other things to think about. Elizabeth wanted us to like talk about the switches in
this model, the switches are only to turn it off or on, because when I was testing it, we needed to turn them on or off to see what. This model wasn't built by building the whole thing first. This model was built by putting the main concepts in and then turning things on gradually as something worked. So in this particular model, there wasn't enough time to do what we did in the second model, which is to actually put the switches in a table. So basically, they're on-off switches. They're 1 or 0. It turns off. It'll turn off the input. They're just test switches.
They're right. Okay. So I think, Pascal, maybe one other thing to point out is that in this model we have we have reputation and perceived organizational response set up as these biflows, kind of like a smooth-like structure.
Mhm.
And then for audience and media, this other very generic structure of kind of a first-order information delay, if you will, for audience interest and media attention. In this case, you're basically saying you know something about how long it will take to kind of dissipate audience interest. That's what these draining processes are doing. And here you're hypothesizing explicitly something that's building it up. And I don't know if we want to say anything about how we are media attention. Are we scaling anything?
So let me say one thing about media attention. I first thought, well, maybe so the effect of audience interest would be change in the time. Go back to that one slide. I changed the media decay time, but I didn't do that because that didn't work very well. So I made the affect the increasing attention piece. So the effect is there as opposed to the time. In the other model, or another place we just talked about changing the time. So how your effect could either change the inflow or change the outflow in different ways. And so yeah, it's one thing to think about when you're deciding what the effect of audience interest was on immediate attention.
Again, this was just how we were setting up the.
Well, yeah, that's just we set up the. So you can always change this. We set up our inputs different ways, but that's just a spike. That's a spike in the beginning that sets the crisis off, and then as you can see the crisis unfold in time once that initial story comes in, or once that initial crisis, like Greenpeace attacks the German shell company, and then now you look at all the effects. That's just the input, and then based on that input, all the other effects come out. The negative stories, the more the media attention comes in. That's going to affect audience interest all through the model. It's going to affect the stories. It's going to affect the audience interest. Audience interest is going to go back and add more media attention. So you'll see if you look at the model of audience, go down to look at the models. You see a little bump there, media attention. The first bump is when you get your input. Later, it goes up again once you get responses, depending on what the response is and how long it takes for the company to respond. So that's what that is.
So, I mean, some interesting shapes and a lot of things to really kind of like think about. Mm-hmm. And you can see how, interpretability and scaling and being able to kind of compare these ideas and calibration is all very important. And again, thinking very carefully about, what is the purpose of your model? How fine-grained do you need to be with your calibration initially? What is a meaningful time horizon? And then how are you going to kind of like support certain key assumptions? And is the model, generating utility for your audience? Are all things to kind of take into consideration.
And the other thing is that if you create a structure for some of these things, you can always put another one in later. I like to do things iteratively. So this is a really rough structure on how to get this work. It seems to work in some way. Maybe I find a better way of doing media attention and related to audience interest. Maybe there's some other intermediate variable, but once you do it, put it aside and think about what else might work there. I know that John Haywood had someone doing a thesis, and they had another way of relating positive and negative stories, but we did it differently. But we knew about that way. So so there you have options to settle on.
I think like this is really these are examples of how we've kind of examples that we've tried to illustrate in this workshop that you can now kind of play with on your own, we hope.
So let me go to the next. Is there any questions about this model before we move to the next one? And speak your question.
I have a question. It's just a matter of trying to trace down the effect. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at negative stories. In one, it's monotonic. And then the other one, it goes up and then goes down. What are the dynamics of that second?
What do you mean? What do you mean? Okay. Go look at the graphic functions. This is the perceived response, perceived organizational response, and
no, I can't.
it affects both.
Yes.
Yeah. Go into the graphical function. So that's so. Depending on my we use the same perceived organizational response as an input to both positive and negative stories, but we do it differently. This one, we said, okay, if you're low on the scale of response, your stories are going to be high. And it looks like this.
Yeah.
And then now shift to the other one, the positive story one. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I wanted to say, click on that. Now, it's the opposite. If I have a better organizational response, I have more positive stories. So those two graphs and those strengths we give them are going to influence what it looks like.
And here, Pascal's like, he's being mindful. He knows what the range is for perceived organizational response. It's going to be from 1 to, in this case, 2.
2.1.
Ralph, is that helpful, or do you have any other thoughts about that?
It's helpful, but I always wonder when most of the situations are that it's monotonic, and then what you get is if this were not a psychological type of variable, you could get the increase and then followed by a collapse because of some sort of resource being used up.
Well, we don't. That's not the way this was created. But I see your point. Yeah.
Ralph, are you saying that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that because I'm also interested in the negative stories. And is there like a threshold for how bad a story there would be before the customer actually quits the company? Do you have like a threshold or something?
No, that detail was not in this model. In fact, we looked. I think a lot of thought has to. Companies do this, by the way. There are companies that go out in the world and measure story strength and how many there are, and there might be some good algorithms for that, but I don't know them. I just knew that companies did them, and I sort of made up something. That I saw I figured. I just made up something, but yes.
But it's a very valid point. And the thing is, like, there could be a threshold because if we go back to this, right, we have main media attention. All we're really saying here is there's a delay, but, I could see kind of like restructuring this so that media attention is driving negative stories. And then there's a certain threshold of negative stories that is driving the organizational response. So
yeah, I thought of having a threshold for when you actually need to worry about your media attention. I almost put that in there, but it's just too complicated. But you can have thresholds in here for when you need to worry, when the organization needs to worry about media attention. Maybe it's 30% needs to worry about it. And then when you're counting stories, I thought of using Google Trends. Google Trends has some data, but it doesn't have negative, positive data. It just has interest data. So
But I really like the question because it may be complicated for you, Pascal, but not for our participant. So I keep playing around with that again and thinking about, okay, what would building in a threshold of negative stories look like?
Couldn't you have a variable that's like switching costs? That's essentially what she's talking about.
Switching costs?
Yeah, it's a business term, how much pain does the customer have to feel before they switch to another company?
Yes, that could be in here also. That could be in the other model as well. Yes. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
No, these are good points.
That would be a psychological variable that would be in there that you can measure. How much pain? If there are switching costs, I know because if I'm in the iPhone world, then go to Samsung world is going to be hard for me. So there's a cost because I already have a product in our product line, and the cost is high.
How many brain cells would you kill going, making that switch? That's how I measure those sort of technology switches.
I would say a very lot of brain cells at my age. Whereas my both sons have Samsung phones. They had no
They
problem
weren't.
switching.
They haven't killed off as many brain
No,
cells
they,
yet.
they had no problem switching. They started out with iPhones, no problem switching. So yeah, you're right.
Eduardo asked a question, how do you include effect sizes from psychological literature in the model? And I think, I was just typing, I think that the lookup tables that relate that show those bivariate relationships that we've been talking about is a very effective way of doing it. I think,
Okay, while you're talking, I'm going to switch to the other model because I think we need to go to that one.
and Eduardo, I would also say that, you know, sometimes so again, we've been playing with this idea. Keep in mind, like, if we think about effect sizes and we're thinking about something with an effect between 0 and 1 in a clinical trial or in some sort of study, that's going to show kind of like, that's going to be evidence that things are kind of like being suppressed or dampened versus anything above 1, 1.1 multiplying by 2, 3, maybe 5-fold, you know, looking at kind of a relative risk. You can use it that way. And I mean, I find, again, like reflecting on the properties of a scale that includes 1 and 0 and then thinking about how you can use that to amplify or kind of like dampen effects over time is important. And again, citing that literature, saying, you know, we know something about the effect size here on average for a particular population. And then playing out those scenarios. But I think in general, building those in using, you know, effect variables that are auxiliaries using that lookup feature in the software is probably the most typical way of doing it, and definitely, you know, an acceptable way. Okay.
So again, we're still learning about this as we do more and more models and think about what else to think about. I'm gonna talk about this other model we have. But first, I want to say that I'm not sure if we're getting to build model and we didn't intend to get to it, but you can look into this one later if we don't get to it today. Also, if you click on the right hand here for annotated bibliography, you can go into on my website. Oops, well, that didn't work. But on the website, there is an annotated bibliography of some of the references to this right here. That worked. And it's got some updates this year. Okay. So the other thing was, go back to the model. The other thing was, this again is a link to the models, and I'm going to update, maybe not today, but I will update some changes we may have made during this discussion today. The other thing is that I've been meeting with a group, John Hayward, Dana Paul-Jabari, and others. We meet every 4 to 6 weeks. And we discuss system dynamics and human behavior. And if someone already sent me an email about joining that group, and it's a free group. We meet usually on Friday afternoons in Eastern Daylight Time because John is in UK. And many of us sometimes get together and work on models together and publish papers. Otherwise, we just discuss things. We did a lot on the collapse models. We did a lot on how does sociology affect our models. John Haywood, the next meeting will be in late August. John Haywood's going to talk about human factors in this political models, in this political system dynamics models. So navigating the map, this helps. And you can filter things out of the map, and I discuss that later. So now I'm going to go into this reputation, offerings, and quality model, which is the second model we chose. Let me get into that. Okay, let me close this up. So, oops. This model, and I went over this earlier, it's about a company wanting to attract creative employees so they can create offerings to bring in customers and clients. And they have a quality issue. And based on this quality issue, they could lose customers. Some of their good employees are being directed to do things they hate to do. So there's a loyalty issue with employees. So that's so they try to retain customers and still maintain their current employees to be able to create these products to keep more employees. So that's this called loop diagram. And there are different things that let me make this smaller. So I don't know if you're familiar with Hamlet. There's a model that's also in our my website that has when does Hamlet decide to kill Claudius, and the students can actually plot sort of like a profile in different parts of the play, and they can debate about it, where to put the best place, and to show at one point Hamlet kills Claudius. So I have a similar profile. So at a certain period of time, customers' concerns go up, and then they slowly change and go down. And what's the effect of this on this profile on how the company responds to it? So the way I want to go through the model. The way this model starts out is I wanted to say, okay, I have loyalty here in the model, and how do we represent loyalty? Well, loyalty is really an attribute, a soft attribute of employees in the company. And loyalty is going to decrease when they become unhappy. So this is, although it looks very complicated, David, Deb Polk, and Ralph Levine and I wrote a paper on co-flows in System Dynamics Review. And there's a link in the PowerPoint. There's a free version of it, and it was sponsored by NIH. So there's a free version of it there, same paper you can look at if you want to. But it talks about this particular situation where in our paper we said, okay, if there's a problem with loyalty, then management can do something to increase loyalty or whatever attribute it was in the company, and everything will go hunky-dory or very well. But in our paper, the same structure, I'm saying, okay, there's things management can do to make people less loyal. Same structure. I had a negative sign though. And so I wanted to illustrate this concept, and it's very well written. And, I think it's well written, of course, but it's well described in this paper what the equations are like. But I wanted to at least put it in a way that you can see it. And in another, we had an example of
Pascal, maybe it's worth saying, like, this is not kind of like the classic kind of co-flow, right?
Yes. Yeah, I can say that. Yeah, we wrote the paper. This paper is based on Ralph's thinking. And we made a rigorous analysis of his thinking and put it into a paper.
Remember, a co-flow is an attribute of some other, a
hard variable.
Usually it's very nice for doing psychological models, because usually you're representing some psychological or soft construct related to, in this case, people in a firm or people in a community or something like that. And it allows you to kind of show the average attribute over time. And there are a couple of different structures for that, and then Ralph was even saying, okay, we can embroider on what's kind of called a traditional co-flow, or the Hines co-flow after Jim Hines, and show that there's some internal change going on. Or additional external effects that are driving that attribute. So that's what you've done here, right, Pascal?
Yes, that's what we've done. And
can you want to talk about the switches here? Do they have
yes, the switches here. Okay, so let's look at. So I'll get to the switches in a second. Okay. I just wanted to go through the overall model. In this model, we have a increasing reputation and decreasing. The reason I did that was that I had things affecting both separately. I had customer concerns affecting how long customers spent in we showed already how long customers spent, in the if they and then we had the effect of offerings on reputation. So we had this is 3 effects. Well, yes, the reputation affects winning customers, but there were several effects, and since there were separate ones on different parts of the model, I had biflow. I had inflow and an outflow. Offerings. This is a made up. Let's see. Yeah, this is about creating things and generic term offerings. By the way, in the way of units, when you look at units, And if you worry about units, my unit for here was offerings. You can convert units later, but I like to have, my units here was reputation. So for the model, it helped me to think through and make sure everything was consistent. Units help me decide whether the model is correct or not. So even though you might think it's unitless, it's sometimes good to put a unit of something in it like that, so you can see the correctness of what you're doing. So that was a check, mental check. So if you look at the switches, there's an on-off switch. This switch, when I turn it off, when I turn it off, it has this top plot here where everything is hunky-dory, reputation is gradually increasing, customers are going up. But if I go here and turn, and you can do that by turning these things, if I make that 0. So watch this customer concerns here. Everything. So if I make that 0, oops, why can't I run it? Oops. I wonder if invalid equation. What did I do? Oh, make it 0.
By the way, I'm so impressed with the new features that Stella Architect has for building out, publishing your model and turning it into kind of a user interface.
Well, even yesterday, I saw the feature of looking at generating a closed loop diagram from your flow. So I'm not brave enough to do it today because I was just learning about it yesterday, but I want to do it for these models.
Right.
So this one, the customer concerns is off. So we're here at the top, the blue or the black. That's where we're there. Once I put customer concerns on, then I will see the red here that dips. And notice that even though your reputation goes back up here, you lose customers. You don't gain any more customers. So your offerings is the same, your employees are the same, your loyalty is back to normal, but your history has caught up with you. It's like hysteresis in a magnetic field. You lost something here.
Very interesting.
That's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So there are other switches you could turn off. If you turn off loyalty, for example, if I turn off all my loyalty switches, and this was interesting, I don't understand quite what's going on here, but if you turn off loyalty, so you don't have to worry about loyalty. 3 switches. By the way, if I were to keep going with this model, I'd probably put it had an interface and put it on.
No, there's always
there's always more to do. In fact,
it depends on again, do you need to build an interface?
Yeah, not for this one.
Maybe.
So I have, I turned off loyalty. Remember here, loyalty was going to take customers away.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens? Okay, I have more employees. My reputation hasn't increased that much. My average loyalty is just a little lower. I don't have any much of a change in anything else. So does loyalty impact us? But I turned it completely off. So this is a question. Have I put loyalty correctly in this model, or does it matter? Does it really matter?
Is it within, are there loops going through loyalty?
Loyalty just affects, loyalty affects the amount of employees that come in. The more I thought the more employees came in, the more you'd have to create offerings, but that doesn't seem to work here. Well, so
looking at the loop power, the strength of the loop, it makes a lot of sense to try to take a look at what happens over time.
So that would point out to me that I really need to rethink loyalty. Have I put in the model right? Maybe it's not strong enough, or maybe I'm not reflecting what's in the real world. So those are types of things you can do.
Isn't loyalty being defined as like how long this employee is going to stick with this company doing something that's really not what they want to do, which is mitigate performance problems instead of being creative?
Okay.
At some point they get to the end of their rope, right?
Yeah. So let me say one thing. I just noticed that when I did this, I did it when there was no concerns. So let me put concerns on and run the model again. This goes to show you there's always something to learn. Now there's concerns. Does loyalty affect anything else? Okay, here we go. Oh, so now I have the concerns on it. This is all powerful now. And it does have a slight dip over there, but not much. It does have less custom, it does have, that's interesting. It has more custom offerings, but it doesn't affect customers in or out. So again, I think loyalty needs to be investigated in this model. So that's the type of thing. You create a model, you look at it, you test it, and this is the stage of this model is at the test stage. Is this, do I need to make loyalty stronger? How do I do that? You know, the effect stronger. So so there's I have a pain factor here. If I make the pain bigger, well, maybe not. Look, it's even make it gigantic. It doesn't seem to affect it. So something's going on here that we need to investigate.
It's kind of interesting to think about the dynamics of the problem.
Yeah.
Then at that point, perhaps building a cybernetic model of the intervention.
Yeah. Oh, yes. What would the intervention? And I have an intervention. Do I have an intervention? Yes. I have the intervention I have in here is directing employees to handle quality issues. That's this intervention, which may not be the best thing to do. It might be better to hire new people to work on that specifically and have, this is a made up problem.
Yeah.
To have creative people doing just creative things. And, but anyway, so again, these models aren't perfect, and that's how you investigate them and create them. Anyone have any more questions about this particular one? You can play with it. And if you have any questions after the workshop, feel free to contact.
The idea.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I'm sure others have questions because I've talked a lot, I think.
Yeah, it's perfectly okay. It's
okay.
It gives me a break.
we had a workshop yesterday about a peace engineering in the Arctic.
Yeah, I thought about that going there.
Yeah, so the problem is very similar to this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's
I didn't go, so I didn't hear, but I thought about going. So you can explain how it's similar.
Well, the two variables, or I don't know what to call them, were keeping peace. That was the one. Let's say the goal-seeking behavior of the system, keeping peace, but also keeping the well-being of the inhabitants of the area.
Yeah.
And it seems those two were incompatible in a way. Because, you know, in order to keep peace, you had to let countries and companies come into the area to take oil and minerals.
Ah, yes, I
right?
can see that, yeah.
And then that would destroy the well-being.
So these techniques are probably, I haven't checked that out, but these techniques might be applicable to that. And if, I probably need to go in and download the material so I can see it if they have anything.
Yeah, because I think reputation would probably be the same as the attractiveness of the area in the Arctic or something.
Yeah.
The attractiveness, yeah.
So we can open this up to general questions. Anyone have any general questions about what we've done, can see it applicable to their models, would like, to see something else eventually, what, because the system dynamics and human behavior group, we can actually do whatever we want to during that session. I know it's not good timing for everybody. It's 1:30 Eastern Daylight Time, but we record the sessions, so.
Yeah, and the idea was to really just show some general structures that can be adapted in different models, and also just this process of building confidence about how to kind of take ideas and maybe a literature that may be very obtuse and start to think about how to use it for your modeling.